Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello and welcome to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about nutrition, hunger, and social responsibility. Specifically, school-age students and the coping mechanisms, long-term implications, and some tangible takeaways to reassure healthcare professionals and parents or caregivers about nutrient-rich food sources that are accessible and affordable. My guest today is Clancy Harrison. She's a registered dietitian, food equity advocate, international speaker, and author who strives to dramatically shift the conversation around food, health, and social responsibility. Welcome to the show, Clancy.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm certainly excited and honored to be here today.
Oh, I'm so excited to talk with you. And I am welcoming you back to the podcast because you were on the show about a year and a half ago, March of 2021, talking with me about food insecurity and food injustice. And that was episode 172. So I encourage people to dial back and listen to that. And I'll put the link in my show notes to make it easy for people to do that because we covered a lot of ground on that episode. But before we dive in, I do want our listeners to know that this podcast episode is a paid collaboration between Sound Bites and Beef It's What's for Dinner, a contractor to the Beef Checkoff. As a compensated member of the Beef Expert Bureau on behalf of the Beef Checkoff, my role is to share the science and support for beef's role in a healthy diet. And we are also submitting this episode to the Commission on Dietetic Registration for one free continuing education credit for registered dietitian nutritionists, dietetic technicians registered, and certified diabetes care and education specialists. So listeners can check out the show notes or my free CEU library at soundbitesrd.com for more information. Now, Clancy, I would love for you to share a little bit more about your background and your work, how you came to be a food equity advocate, and even what that is, as well as any disclosures you have to note.
Thank you, Melissa. In regards to disclosures, I regularly speak for Beef Checkoff as well, along with Tropicana and National Dairy Council. So it's certainly a privilege to be able to be here again. In regards to my background, I'm a dietitian just like you. I ran a food pantry for 13 years, and specifically during COVID, over 3 million meals our team fed in our community.
Wow.
As everyone, I'm sure, had to pivot and make adjustments, we did the same. But now I have a podcast, the Food Dignity Podcast, and a platform, the Food Dignity Institute, and I'm a food equity advocate. And some people are kind of like, what does that mean, Clancy? What do you consider with that? And a long time ago, when I first started this, I saw myself as part of the problem. I saw myself with a lot of judgment, misconceptions, and that all went away when I started volunteering. And when I started realizing that about myself, I was paying more attention to what media was saying. And I realized that there were a lot of other people that shared my same thought processes, whether it was judgment, assumptions, misconceptions. And I thought for the longest time, I wanted to fight childhood hunger. In my mind, I thought I could end childhood hunger. But at the end of the day, it's a heavy task to put on yourself, right? Like it takes every single one of us and all of our unique assets that we bring to the table. And I came to the conclusion that if I'm going to make an impact, I can only make an impact through the lessons I've learned. And so that's how I really approach advocacy. I believe if we're going to fight any injustice and we're going to have an equitable food system or any system out there, we really need to address our internal biases, what we might put shame on to other people, whether that's through judgment, assumptions, and misconceptions. And so when I look at equity in that mindset, we really need to start with ourselves internally so that we can really start making changes outside of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So as we discussed in episode 172, food insecurity is more prevalent and closer to home than many people realize. And we know it's gotten worse during the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
Now with rising food costs due to multiple factors, which, by the way, I discuss in episode 217, if anyone wants to tune into that. So let's start by discussing some of those statistics and realities.
Sure.
Perhaps and bring us up to speed on where things are now as, we're heading into fall and back to school time, especially since our focus today will be on school-age children and adolescents.
And I have to be completely transparent here. I'm afraid to give any stat. At this point, I think with everything happening in our society, whether it's the gas prices you just talked about, the grocery store, if I'm standing in a grocery store and I just stand and try to listen to other conversations, and I do this all the time because I'm a little nosy. And so I like to just listen to people, and you will hear, I can't afford this. I don't know how my daughter, my son is paying for food when they have teenagers, they have adolescents, children. So if you look at the statistics right now, the USDA says that more than 38 million people are food insecure, including 12 million children. And that was data from 2020. So we are in 2022. And now if you even add on, besides the gas prices, COVID, grocery store inflation, school meal programs are going back to where they were prior to COVID. And so what does that mean? During COVID, all children in schools received free meals, breakfast and lunch. And now they're going back to, if you were a child who qualified for reduce or free, you'll have access. You have to fill out the application process. And if you're paid, you're going back to a paid student. So we have that compounding all of this other. So I'm hesitant to give statistics because I feel like by the time you publish this podcast,
they're outdated.
Honestly, they're outdated.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know how we can accurately be keeping up to date with that right now, because I feel like it's constantly, every time I turn on the news, there's another struggle that people are faced with.
Absolutely. So the latest Dietary Guidelines for Americans highlights how many children and adolescents aren't getting enough high-quality protein, iron, zinc, choline, vitamins B6 and B12. And, these nutrient deficiencies are especially alarming given the significant growth and development that happens during this life stage. So I don't talk about this life stage very often on the podcast. So I'm really happy that we're addressing this because it's so important. So maybe we could talk about the risk factors for childhood hunger.
Sure. So first of all, I think when we're looking at anyone, the face of hunger could be anyone. It could look like anyone. Mm-hmm. And I think we should really make sure that we understand that from the beginning. But if we're going to look at households that are at a higher risk for food insecurity, it's going to be a household that includes any child. And it will get even more severe if the household has a child under the age of 6. We also have a high risk factor for any household that's a single parent or a caregiver. Mm-hmm. And then certainly any household that's been marginalized. So, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, LGBTQ, anyone living with a disability, maybe even someone living with their grandparent as also another household member. So we really need to take a step back and understand that anyone in the United States that has a household with a child is at risk for food insecurity.
Mm-hmm. That's casting a wide net here.
It is.
But we need to do that. We need to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think what's really important to me is that we understand that hunger can be very shameful. People are not going to show up at their doctor's office saying, I'm struggling to feed my child. Mm-hmm. It's not something that we're going to brag about. We're going to be extremely embarrassed. At least this is my experience when I'm working with our populations that we serve. We just recently, I think this is very important to talk about, but we did a focus group with 300 students. So we had 10 different focus groups throughout the day at our local Westside Career and Technology Institute. So it's our local VOTEC school district. We actually did not talk about hunger. We talked about bringing in food to save the planet, food that would have otherwise gone into a landfill because one case was damaged, but it was perfectly healthy, great tasting food. And the students were the ones that brought hunger up to the point that they told me some of them were dumpster diving. Many told me that the only meal that they received was the lunch that they got at school that day. They did not have the breakfast program. The breakfast program there went away during COVID, but after school, they would get a snack bag and they would eat that on the bus. But that would be the last thing that they would eat before they got lunch the following day. And then when we set them up as a member agency with our local Feeding America food bank, we had students tell us they will not fill out the self-declaration form, which is just a typical form, your name, your address, how much money is in the household brought in, the income level. And they said they were afraid that if they filled this form out, it would alarm the officials in our area and they would be taken to children and youth. And there was more fear of being taken away. There was so much fear of being taken away from their parents that they would rather go hungry and not have the help. This wasn't just one student. This was many students in those focus groups and working with the guidance counselors after. And so we have a lot of barriers. There's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of fear. I've had people refuse to get help at the food pantry because they might, again, if they are an immigrant and they're working on getting their visa and all of these other things, that they would be deported. So, we're seeing not only the shame, but then there's also fear that something significant could happen.
I think that's really important that you highlighted that. The fear is such a big barrier to just talking about things. And if we can't talk about it, how can we solve these problems? So how are students, families coping with these risk factors and with hunger itself? What are you seeing?
If I'm working with a family, there's a lot of anxiety around where the next meal is going to come from. There's a lot of stress that goes in with this. So there's food anxiety that happens. I have personally seen, we can have a party, we can have an office party. And we know if we have pizza, it's going to bring people together. But we work with a lot of nonprofits who might not make food access a priority, but they're working with a food insecure population, whether it's drug and alcohol recovery, Victims Resource Center, Volunteers in Medicine, school districts. We know if we bring pizza. So what happens is if we have that food, you'll see a lot of binge eating at that moment, but then also hoarding and taking food home with them. So we know to have that extra food when we're working in the populations who are food insecure. We also see diet monotony. So that might mean I'm eating instant noodles day in and day out. I'm going to eat pasta day in and day out. I'm not saying any of those are bad, but we certainly want to have variety in the types of food. We also see a decrease in the nutrition quality. So what do I mean by that? Maybe we're getting a highly processed white bread. Again, nothing wrong with that, but we might be opting out for a bread that might be higher in fiber, have more nutrients in that bread. So we're seeing also an inadequate food intake. So we might be skipping meals. Mom might skip a meal, dad might skip a meal so their child can eat. We might see the caregiver diluting milk or formula for the baby. I always tell this story about a mom feeding their child soda to get rid of the hunger pains. So it's the sugar and the carbonation makes them feel fuller so they don't have the hunger pains. When I share that story, I've had people approach me saying that they did the same thing, that they were extremely embarrassed about it, but they knew it worked. It took the hunger pains away. And I even had someone tell me that they would use soda with their cereal instead of milk. And this was a SNAP educator at one of my conferences when I was done speaking. We do see people barter for food. They might access food in socially uncomfortable ways. And you might wonder, what does that mean? Well, I already gave an example with the student dumpster diving. But even if you think of the word socially uncomfortable, going to a food pantry could be socially uncomfortable and very embarrassing for someone. And then certainly not the last one. I can keep going, but I'll slow down here. The last one, which I think is really important for this podcast, is not eating the animal protein such as beef, chicken, and pork. Again, relying on a lot of carbs.
Right. And to your point, we always talk about the importance of a variety of foods to get the variety of nutrients that those different foods provide. So the monotony and the same, just kind of filling up on whatever's going to fill the belly, not really having the capacity to think about, well, what nutrition is this food providing? I just need to fill my belly, and a lot of meal skipping.
I just need to eat.
Right. So we're talking about students, families. What about schools, school districts, communities? How are they coping with this?
Well, I'm not a food service director anymore in the school districts, but I do speak to a lot of school food service directors. And I think their biggest problem is coping with the supply chain when we're talking schools. School districts, we need to understand, have very strict guidelines with the National School Lunch Program. And what does that mean? They have to produce a monthly calendar, the production sheets of actually producing the food, and then what was actually served and taken. Now, you have your monthly calendar menu set and it's all into the state. And now you go and you try to buy something and you can't get it, then you start not meeting the requirements. And now you have a food service director. I heard a lady stand up when I was speaking at No Kid Hungry in Michigan. I sat in on one of their sessions on supply chain. A lady stood up and said, I used to spend 2 hours a week on my ordering. I spend 40 hours a week because now I'm driving around to different stores trying to find the ingredients so we can meet the requirements of the National School Guidelines.
Oh, my goodness.
Could you imagine?
Mm-mm.
So they're coping. And now think of WIC with the formula shortage that we just had. I think when we think more on an institutional level, it's supply chain and trying to navigate everything that's happened within the supply chain and meet those strict requirements of nutrition, which are so important for our kiddos.
Right. There's so many layers to this. And every time I talk to you, my mind is blown. It's like, I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought. And you even say, and I think we discussed this in the previous podcast, you still have that reaction when you learn something new, another layer, another story that you hear. Another story that you share.
Oh, totally.
It is very, very layered, very complex. And, I think we often think about the short-term consequences of hunger, but you're in a position to shed some light for us about some of the long-term implications, because I don't think anybody out there wants children to be hungry or doesn't care about hungry children, but I don't think the long-term consequences get as much attention or understanding. So I'd love for you to share some of that.
Think about nutrition and how important it is for growth and development. And if we're not getting the nutrients that we need to thrive, we're going to experience, especially newborns, maybe birth complications, birth defects, low birth weight. And that's just going to keep getting worse as the child gets older and still lacking nutrition. With that comes developmental problems, maybe that's slow growth or even cavities, iron deficient anemia, and a lot of other nutrient deficiencies. We have lower cognitive indicators, emotional distress, poor behavior. So imagine if you were a child and you're in class and you are so hungry, but you don't understand those physical sensations. You don't understand the emotional and the mental. You don't really understand what's going on. And you act out because that's all you're thinking about and you're mad and you're upset. I mean, just think about how you get when you're hungry. I'm miserable. Now, imagine if I didn't understand that and I couldn't curb those hunger pains. How is that child going to concentrate on their spelling, pass their spelling? How are they going to go to the next grade? Are they going to go to a trade school and they graduate? Hopefully they can. Or are they going to go off to college? Or, did something else happen? So, when we think about this, we need a strong future. And with that comes strong children. Other things that could happen is children are sick more often. So they're going to the emergency room. They might forego medical care because the family cannot pay their co-payments to go, or they might not have the gas money to get to that preventative care. So instead, they're going to go to the urgent care when something happens. We're seeing a lot of depression, anxiety, and any of this that's happening as a child is going to lead to later adult diseases such as diabetes and poor cardiovascular health. So, when we really start thinking about the consequences of childhood hunger, it truly does impact all of us.
Right. Obviously, good nutrition is important for health, growth, development. And there are some specific reasons why childhood or adolescence is that pivotal time for proper nutrition, and why these nutrition deficiencies are common during these years. So I pulled some information. The 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans report points out many school-aged children and adolescents, particularly adolescent girls, are falling short on a constellation of critical nutrients, including high-quality protein, iron, zinc, choline, and B vitamins. These nutrients help fuel healthy growth and development, including academic performance. Now, heme iron, like that found in animal proteins like beef, it's not in plant foods. It's critical to reversing iron deficiencies. So in general, adolescent females tend to consume less meat, poultry, and eggs than adolescent males, which can also result in them not getting enough protein. And it could exacerbate those iron deficiencies. And I did a recent podcast on micronutrient deficiencies with Dr. Ty Beal, and that was episode 219, if anybody wants to tune into that. But Clancy, talk to me a little bit about this time of growth and development. There's so much going on. The needs are increased. The intake is decreased. It's this perfect storm, if you will.
Yeah. So I think the bottom line is they're growing fast. They need the nutrients. We know that this is strongly related to food insecurity. And I think we should also bring something else in here too, and that's picky eating. And I only say that because I also think that that's just the age of the child. I have an extreme picky eater, and it creates a lot of stress, I think, for parents. And now imagine if the child was food insecure.
Oh, I'm glad you brought up the picky eating because, you start with the food insecurity, then you add the layer of growth and development, and then you add the layer of picky eating, which I actually did an episode not too long ago, episode 210, I believe, on picky eating with a pediatrician. Mm-hmm. Then you add maybe the layer of food intolerance, and I did an episode related to that as well. So there's so many layers that can complicate the situation. I know that we're talking about nutrition and deficiencies and growth and development, and we're going to share some strategies and takeaway tips in a little bit. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you to talk us through a little bit about how you talk about social responsibility. What does that mean? And what can we as people in our community, maybe we're healthcare professionals, maybe we're not, what do we need to know or understand about the social responsibility layer?
Sure. So first of all, I pulled the definition of social responsibility. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read it. So sure. Social responsibility in business, also known as corporate social responsibility, pertains to people, and I want to stress the word people, in organizations behaving and conducting business ethically and with sensitivity towards social, culture, economic, environmental issues. So first of all, I love the definition. But for me, I want to dive a little bit deeper. The words that stuck out to me was people, a person, because I do think that we are individual people that can make the greatest impact. Sometimes we might get stuck thinking, oh, well, I've already tried to get my university to do this. I've already tried to get the doctors to do this or the hospital to do this. We don't have to create system and policy change. That would be great if we did. But the word, again, people, and then sensitivity towards social, cultural, economic, and environmental issues. And obviously for me, this is childhood hunger, and social responsibility is taking hunger out of the charity box. So many times we think, oh, well, the church is going to feed people at the food pantry. Feeding America, which is great. They have food banks that supply, food to the food pantries. They are the leading organization. Yes, there is space and room for them and food pantries. They can't do it by themselves. And we really need to understand, especially childhood hunger impacts everyone. So if kids are sick more often, how does this impact healthcare costs? How does this impact, if you're a business owner, how does that impact your utilization rates that you pay a lot of money for your employees? That has a big impact on you. If a college student is dropping out of college because they cannot afford food, how does this impact the retention rate of the university? If our children are not strong and we're seeing we just talked about all of the impacts that hunger has on a child, how does this impact our future military forces and our national security? For anyone listening, it's super important that we understand how hunger impacts you specifically. And so what I ask people is to kind of take a step back, think about your mission, your work, what do you do, and how does that correlate to a future healthy population? And we all need a future healthy population if we're going to be successful in anything. So for me, that is social responsibility. How do you make that connection? And then many people will say, Clancy, I don't have time to volunteer at a food pantry, or our food pantry doesn't want the help. But I'm going to ask you, what are you good at? What are your assets? What can you bring to the table? We all have individual things that we can bring to the table. Maybe you're good at detail. Maybe you're good at social media. Maybe you're an engineer and can help a food pantry be safer, a car line. We can all bring our passions and what we're good at to the hunger fight. And it's so, for me, it's like, where do you find that crack? And you don't have to look outside of your faith-based organization, your school, your place of employment, maybe even your house to be the glue that we need in our society.
Mm-hmm. Right. As I'm hearing you talk, a lot of us feel like, I'm just one person. What can I do? And you see some of those traditional ways of, the volunteering at the food pantry and
food drive,
the food drives and all of that. And we think, we're not finding that right fit for us. And we think, well, I'm just one person. I can't make a difference. But what I'm hearing you say is it starts within to just understand it at the level that we're discussing today. And that's where it has to start. We can't make these external changes if we don't start there.
Yep. And I mean, it could be a simple change as just trying to learn more about hunger. And it could also be something, if you ever heard me talk before, I talk about my judgments. And if you find yourself in a place judging, just start by questioning that and trying to learn more about that. Where did it come from? What could be a potential different way of describing the situation or understanding of the situation? A good example of that would be the drive-through of the food pantry. With COVID, I went to a drive-through and I heard a lot of people saying, oh, wow, they have nice cars. They don't need to come to the food pantry. And so at that point, I say, let's just take a step back and think of, well, how could that be? Maybe they're borrowing a car, their boss's car, their sister's car. Maybe it is their car, but they lost their job and they haven't been able to sell it yet. And you can't eat a car, but you can still use.
You said that. You can't eat a car.
You can't. I know. I say it all the time.
You can't eat a cell phone, but it's so impactful. You can't eat a cell phone. Why do they have cell phones?
I have to say it over and over again because it's just so, to me, it's something simple that we can all do. It's just question if we find ourselves in a place of judgment.
Yeah, just trying to see it from a different perspective and learning more and asking those questions for sure. Well, that makes me think about this White House conference that's coming up. And I'd love to get your take on this. I read up on this a little bit. I've been hearing a lot about it. And in September of 2022, for the first time in over 50 years, there will be a White House conference on hunger, nutrition, and health. And that is in response to millions of Americans being afflicted with food insecurity and those diet-related diseases that we talked about, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and how this lack of access to healthy, safe, and affordable food, and we could go on to, safe outdoor spaces, all of these things are contributing to hunger and diet-related diseases and these health disparities. The pandemic exacerbated all of this. I know you're kind of plugged into this conference, and I would love to hear a little bit more about it and share it with our listeners.
Yeah, well, I think what's really important is that they've been having listening sessions. I've sat in on a couple of myself. They've been really gathering people, experts, hunger survivors, hunger heroes, policymakers, bringing people together, farmers, and asking their opinions, their problems, their questions, their concerns, their solutions. And it's been going on for a couple months now. So they are putting all of this together. They're going to have their conference on September 28th. You will be able to log on virtually. I urge anyone, if you can't be there, to at least watch the recordings. They're going to lay out some foundation, but that's not just the beginning. It's going to continue to grow and develop, and everyone's voice matters. And I love that they're making it a priority to get as many voices involved. And then once that happens, there's different ways that you can get involved. So maybe you want to host a day of service. And I challenge you to think outside the box. Like, what does that mean to you? How could you support, going off of what we just talked about? How can you provide your services? And it might be calling up, one thing that we've worked with are nonprofits that might not make food access a priority. And I've learned so much because we have been able to connect those nonprofits to our local food bank, making food access a priority. So something as simple as that, like it's been a game changer for those organizations. One thing is you can host a fundraiser. Think of some fun things. I know I'm in Pennsylvania, so it's going to start snowing any day now. But maybe one thing that I was thinking about doing was getting a season pass to a ski resort and raffling that off to raise money. I knew that would be something locally here people would get behind. And so maybe there's something local in your community where you can actually, support a local place, venue, company, and also fight hunger all at the same time. I think the first thing is trying to listen and get educated, listen in on the conference, see what they have to say. I'm excited. I don't know what they're going to be saying, but then there will be some suggestions. And part of it is just getting involved in your local community.
Yeah, I have a toolkit that I can link to in my show notes that you shared with me. I found it very interesting. And the goal is to end hunger and reduce diet-related diseases by increasing healthy eating and physical activity by 2030. And they have 5 conference pillars. This is all in the toolkit, but I can just read those real quickly. The first one is to improve food access and affordability. And then there's a little description on what that might look like. The second is to integrate nutrition and health. The third one is to empower all consumers to make and have access to healthy choices. The fourth is to support physical activity for all. And the fifth is to enhance nutrition and food security research. And as we're talking, it just dawns on me that just 2 days ago, over the Labor Day weekend, my husband and I participated in an annual event called Bike the Drive, where they shut down Lakeshore Drive, and it's 30 miles, and you can bike the whole loop. And everybody was asking me, what cause was this for? And I'm like, I don't think it was for anything. But then I looked at the website, and it actually was a fundraiser for a nonprofit company in Chicago that advocates for and supports transportation in the city. So it could be anything from infrastructure for sidewalks, for safe spaces outdoors, for public transportation, and so on. So I kind of contributed to that by doing this fun Bike the Drive. But yeah, it sounds like if we listen in on this conference, there might be things that jump out at us like, that would be something that I could bring a talent to the table, or that I would be interested in learning more about and making that internal connection. And again, like you said, a lot of the problem solving also comes by connecting different organizations that are kind of doing their own thing.
Yes.
And by connecting with a different organization, it can kind of connect those dots and fill the gap of what they aren't able to do, but this organization is.
Yes. Oh, network and community is so important, and we need to come together. Yes, totally.
And communication is at the heart of all of that.
Yes.
Yeah. And for a topic like this, that, like you said, people aren't walking around bragging about the fact that they're food insecure or hungry. I think a lot of the first step is talking about it. But talking with you, I think the first step is also listening and learning more. And I think that's just really powerful.
Yeah, listening to people's stories versus assuming why they're choosing soda over milk or water. I think is a big step, right? It took me a while to get there. And I also want to say, if anyone's listening, I've heard so many moms, because my kids are school age, they're 13 and 11. I've had so many moms in my kids' school district come up to me and be like, well, I've just been waiting to be asked to volunteer. Stop waiting.
Right. Yeah.
You don't have to be asked. Just go knock on a door.
Yeah. And I really like your call to action for thinking about what you could bring to the table. I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I'm in an affluent community. My food pantry is based out of my church, and we get fresh produce from the grocery store and from the farmer's market. And I know that this is more common these days in food pantries to even have fresh produce. I mean, back in the day, forget it.
No.
That wasn't even going to be on the table. But we'd have all this fresh produce, and I thought, well, people don't know what to do with all of this rhubarb. Or we get all these bananas from the grocery store, but the people at the food pantry didn't know, hey, you could tell people to peel the bananas and freeze them. That's going to decrease food waste and improve, just like with school nutrition. school meal programs. They could put all this food out, but if the kids don't eat it, it's not quote unquote nutrition. So how do we address all these little barriers? And one of the things that I thought, well, what I could do as a dietitian is provide information on, okay, how do you properly store and, I don't want to say preserve, but extend the shelf life of this fresh produce? And what do you even do with it? Recipes and storage tips. And so that just came to me. Like, I can do that. That's more beneficial to the group than just, picking up the produce and delivering it, which of course I can do that as well. But me as a dietitian, that's where I thought, hey, I can really make a difference here.
I love that.
Well, that transitions us into sharing some tangible strategies and tips how to include nutrient-rich foods that are accessible and affordable, for those caregivers. I'd love to hear your thoughts on some real specific takeaways.
Yeah, I think the first thing is we really need to end canned food fear. I think if we can do that, think about how great canned produce is. It's shelf stable. It's already cut up. Less time, less skill. So much so, I want to share a little story about my son who's extremely picky, right? So he was helping me stock the food pantry. And I walk in and it looked like he was hugging the shelf. And he was going, ah, with his arms wide, and he's hugging the shelf. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like, this is kind of odd, Cash. And he's like, why don't we have green beans? Why don't we have canned green beans? I want canned green beans. And I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to go get canned green beans. And now think about it this way. We're not food insecure, right? But I want to make sure that, and he's 11, and I want to make sure that he has the skill and the ability. So I get the flip top lid, and he comes home, he grabs his canned green beans, he puts them in the colander, he rinses them. Obviously he can get them open with the flip top, he pops in the microwave, and my son, who's picky, is eating green beans. Do you know what level of peace of mind that brings to me as a dietitian, but also as a mother of the extreme picky eater, right? So I feel like if we can end that food fear of it being unhealthy, we're going to give ourselves more opportunity to increase the amount of produce we consume. One thing that we do a lot with our clients is when we get ground beef at the food pantry, we have canned beans. We teach them recipes where we can add, we actually mash up the black beans and we put them in with the ground beef, and we're able to make multiple meals. We're adding fiber, we're adding more nutrition. They're getting their ground beef. More people are being fed, and they're using the black beans that they might not have used prior. So we're always looking at that.
Yeah, I love how pairing plant and animal proteins with the canned beans and the ground beef, can really help fill the belly, boost nutrition, and extend those food ingredients to help families do more with less. This combination works really well for so many different recipes. It can be used for burgers, burritos, pastas. It's all about that variety and that versatility for both family meals and school meals. So in addition to beef, what else can give you this big nutrition bang for your buck?
Some things that give you the biggest bang for your buck when we're talking about affordable nutrition: oatmeal, super amazing, canned salmon, canned tuna, canned chicken, ground beef, chicken thighs, any type of beans, whether they're dried or canned. Simple produce, potatoes. Potatoes are loaded with vitamin C, but for some reason, I feel like they have a bad rap. I feel like we need to start defending our potatoes here.
Loaded with potassium, too.
Yes. Lettuce is also, and bananas, those are affordable, usually more cost effective. But other things like rice, powdered milk, fluid milk, all fit in a budget. They're things that are all offered at food pantries, Feeding America food pantries for the most part. And certainly casserole dishes are going to be a great option. And there is a link, Melissa, that I found with kansasbeef.org that I will give to you of a bunch of amazing casserole dishes with beef. And
great.
They just look delicious. So I'll make sure I share that with you.
Wonderful. Yes, I think you should partner with the Canned Food Alliance or I love canned beans, canned produce. And I'm always saying, if we can get the world to understand that produce does not have to be fresh or organic, then maybe they would eat more fruits and vegetables, and that those canned items and frozen as well.
Frozen too, yep.
That all counts, and it all makes a big difference. And I think you also have some advice, like sometimes caregivers don't know how much is enough, especially with our conversation earlier about skipping meals or cutting back on portion sizes to try to extend our food. Could you address that? You shared some concerns with me that people have told you about, well, I don't know how much food I should be giving.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a dietitian just like you, and I can tell you that feeding a child can be we want to do the best for our children, right? And we want to make sure that they're well nourished. And I know firsthand with having a picky eater and that struggle to make sure that he's well nourished is sometimes we tend to reflect on the portion sizes that we're eating or the amount of protein that we consume. And we might unconsciously just give that to the child and expect them to eat it. But the reality is, if we're looking at portion sizes that children should eat, let's say ages 5 to 8, it's roughly 3 to 5 ounces. That's 5 to 8 years of age of the child. If you went to a younger child, it would be a little less. If you went to an older child, it's going to be a little bit more. But 3 to 5 ounces of protein for the entire day is really not that much. If you think of a deck of cards, that would be roughly 3 ounces of protein. And some things that have worked really well with me is the little sliders. You can make little mini burgers and kids love them because it's not daunting. They look at this little burger and they're like, oh, wow, that's so cute. I can eat that. It's not big like mommy's or daddy's. And I feel I can actually consume this and feel comfortable, right? Without being intimidated by the size of something. Another thing that works really well with my son who, like I said, over and over again, picky eater, Italian wedding soup. Those little meatballs mixed with the liquid of the soup helps him chew and swallow it a lot easier. I know I have peace of mind. He's getting his protein, and we can round that out with a glass of milk with that soup or that mini burger. And this is throughout the day. It doesn't have to be all in one meal. So as long as we can have peace of mind, knowing that we are doing our best and that little pieces of protein throughout the day is going to add up and it's going to work.
Yeah, that reassurance is really something we wanted to highlight. So thank you.
Yeah. And I also want to just add one more tip about finding affordable foods. And I encourage everyone listening with a child as a caregiver to apply for the National School Lunch and Breakfast Program. Even if you think that you're paid, you qualify for paid. This is a way of fighting hunger. Filling out that application gives permission, takes away stigma and shame from other families. If we're all filling it out and we all want to eat school lunch, you are helping normalize this process. And as an ex-food service director, we need those applications filled out. And so I just urge everyone as we're starting school to make sure you get that application and fill it out.
Yeah, see, that's very counterintuitive. Most people would not think that would be helping.
It does.
But you explain that. They need those applications to get the benefits.
The benefits, the data, the more applications they have, the more successful the program's going to be. It just is. Because if the parent is filling out the application, there's more chance that the child is going to participate. And we need to really understand that there are, I'm going to say it again, strict guidelines, nutritional guidelines for the National School Lunch and Breakfast Program. And as a past food service director, I certainly urge you to call up your food service operation, ask them questions if you have any. Don't follow any type of judgments that you might see on social media because it's not necessarily true.
Right. So yeah, school meals can kind of get a bad rap and they really don't deserve that.
No.
Well, as we're wrapping up, what would you say is the bottom line takeaway? What do our listeners need to do or be aware of?
Whew, that's a loaded question because I could just keep talking and talking and talking. I think the bottom line is that the change is in you. It starts with you.
It starts with you, and you are just one person, but it matters. You can make a difference.
Yep, it's in your heart. It's in your mind. You have the skills and assets. Just put it together and know that if we all start making small changes, whether that's just with our mindset shift, big lasting changes will happen over time. So the takeaway is it's inside you and you have it and you can do it. It's just acknowledging it and connecting to hunger in a different way than we have in the past.
Very good. Well, we've talked about some resources that we'll link to in the show notes, but I know you've got a website and a lot of great information available. So can you share that and any other resources that you wanted to share?
Yeah, sure. So clancyharrison.com. And we also, the nonprofit, the Food Dignity Movement, so fooddignitymovement.org. We are launching our Food Dignity Institute. So it's basically when I get done speaking, people say, Clancy, can you come train, our agency, our university, our healthcare professionals? But unfortunately, I can't be everywhere. Mm-hmm. So we put together this institute. It just went through the peer review process. So we're really excited about the results of that. And we're going to be launching it in the next month. So keep an eye out for that. Because it's just simple. Again, it's one thing that you can bring back to your organization just to build that awareness on what hunger is.
Wonderful. That's fabulous. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And like I said, we'll have all these links in the show notes at soundbitesrd.com. But Clancy, thank you so much for being on the podcast and having this important discussion with me and sharing out all of this important information.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind and with food insecurity in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.